Lyle Humphrey, who several years ago as a fellow at the Met worked with us on the installation of the Mary and Michael Jaharis galleries of Byzantine art as she was finishing her dissertation on a very different topic of the Italian Renaissance at the Institute of Fine Arts. And as we kept trying to decide how these objects from Byzantine Egypt had originally been displayed in the museum, Lyle went into our archives and came up with this information that none of us had known about because they had been off display for so many years. So today she's come back to explore a slightly more specific aspect of it, which is J.Pierpont Morgan's role in driving so much of the material that is part of the Metropolitan Museum's part of the exhibition here. So Lyle Humphrey.
So thank you, Helen, for the opportunity to speak about such a critical period in the formation of the Metropolitan Museum's collections, and a very interesting story. My talk will focus on a handful of objects presented in the exhibition that were acquired during the first 2 decades of the 20th century by J.Pierpont Morgan, the American financier and banker who supported and led the Metropolitan Museum for over 40 years. First as patron with a gift in 1871 for in the amount of $1,000, and later as trustee from 1888 until 1904, and finally as president of the museum from 1904 until his death in 1913. But before I begin, I would like to point out some broader themes in some themes that are illustrated by this micro collection I'm going to be discussing. And these are themes that also characterize American collecting in the second half of the 20th century, and themes that came up in the Scholars' Day on Collecting mentioned earlier by Inga that was held in January 2009 to celebrate 3 decades of collecting under Philippe de Montebello. The first theme is the role of travel in sparking interest in collecting in America and shaping American taste. American travel abroad is the subject of 19th century novels, and I think of Henry James's characters navigating through Venice, and I cannot resist showing you this photograph. This is Mr. Morgan's yacht, the Corsair, anchored in the Bacino di San Marco in 1902. It was his 3rd yacht, built in 1898, and it was his preferred mode of travel around the Mediterranean. The second theme is the symbiosis between private and public collecting. Morgan worked hand in hand with the curators and the director of the Metropolitan Museum, and in forming his own collection and in funding the museum's acquisitions and projects. This relationship is reminiscent of that nurtured by the museum with later collectors such as the Linskys and the Reitzmans. And the third theme is one that was mentioned by Mr. de Montebello himself, and that is that collecting is influenced by the market. And the objects that were assembled around 1900 were by and large excavated in the early years of the 20th century by archaeologists who were working with museum curators. So, to return to our main subject, Mr. Pierpont Morgan's collecting. He was born in 1937 into a patrician American family from Hartford and Boston. His father, Junius Spencer, was a merchant banker, and Pierpont followed in his footsteps and eventually came to dominate American finance after Civil War and up until his death in 1913. He was known as the Napoleon of Wall Street. He financed and consolidated numerous industries, including railroads, electric, and steel. He formed General Electric. This was the result of a merger that he commandeered between Edison, General Electric, and Thomson Houston Electric. And he almost single-handedly saved the country from financial crisis in 1907. So he did not begin collecting until he was around 50 in 1890. And his early interests were rare books, illuminated manuscripts, first editions, and autographs. And by 1900, his collection was so large that he commissioned Charles Follen McKim to build his grand library on East 36th Street. And as you know, this collection, the building and its contents were donated to the city of New York in 1924. But around 1900, his interests turned to other objects. These were Egyptian antiquities, Assyrian art, classical antiquities, Byzantine and Western medieval ivories and enamels, medieval and Renaissance metalwork and sculpture, Old Master paintings, and French decorative arts. He began to collect art at a frenetic pace and was known to acquire objects en bloc. He would acquire entire collections, such as those two formed by the Parisian designer Georges Hunchal. He acquired these collections in 1906 and gave a collection of decorative arts to the museum in 1910, and then he loaned the huge collection of medieval art to the Metropolitan Museum, and that eventually was donated to the museum after his death. So he, in his will, left instructions that his art be made available for the instruction of the American people. Therefore, his only son, Jack, decided in 1917 to give 40% of the collection to the Metropolitan Museum. This bequest included 7,000 objects, and some of Pierpont's most celebrated purchases were part of the 1917 bequest. Today, a handful of these objects are included in the exhibition Byzantium and Islam. And they include these magnificent 7th century silver plates illustrating events from the life of the biblical King David, to which I'll return in a moment, but first refer to some of the other smaller objects that you'll find in galleries 2 through 6. They include 2 fragments of tusks carved with the Ascension of Christ that are in Gallery 2. They were carved sometime between the 8th and 11th centuries, evidently by the same workshop. They also include a dazzling gold necklace with open work pendants made somewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean in the 7th century and purchased by Mr. Morgan in Paris in 1911. They exemplify luxury art from Byzantium and are related to some other pieces of gold that were acquired by Mr. Morgan in around 1906. And finally, the exquisite Fieschi Morgan True Cross reliquary, fabricated of gold, silver, and cloisonné enamel. And this object belonged to Pope Innocent IV and remained in the family of Innocent IV, the Fieschi family, until 1798. And this was purchased from the dealer Jacques Seligman in Paris by Mr. Morgan in 1906. So, the David plates. These were discovered in 1902 in Karavas on the northern coast of Cyprus. They were found buried with other treasures, including gold jewelry, and they were probably buried in the 7th century as Arabs were invading the island of Cyprus. They are made of solid silver that is cast, hammered, engraved, and punched. And The stamps on the reverse date them to between 613 and 629 to 30. We believe that they were made closer to 629 because of the subject matter of the largest plate, showing the confrontation between David and Goliath. This is likely a reference to the Emperor Heraclius's defeat of the Persians in 629. Heraclius was described as a second David. He named his own son David, and he single-handedly defeated the general Rhodzatus to end the Persian War and reconquer Jerusalem and Egypt and other parts of the Byzantine Empire. So this is absolutely exquisite. All these plates exemplify the highest levels of goldsmith's work in this period. All of these objects reflect what Morgan's librarian, Belle de Costa Green, called the luxury and gorgeous barbaric beauty of the church in the early days. This is a quotation that came out of Jean Strauss's excellent biography of Pierpont Morgan. In 1881, he traveled to the Holy Land, and he described falling to his knees in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and he thought that he had spotted the place where David triumphed over Goliath. So Morgan's fascination with sacred objects and places explain his acquisition of objects like the David plates. And in particular, he was drawn to Egypt. He made his first voyage there in 1871 with his family, and I show you a photograph of Morgan with his second wife and their 4 young children. They are attended by Egyptian servants, a dragoman, a French physician and nurse, a European waiter, and their regular courier. So, like other travelers of the Gilded Age, they wish to enjoy the exotic spectacle of Egypt with little sacrifice of Western comforts and customs. And this was followed, this discovery or travel to Egypt that Mr. Morgan called his beloved Egypt. This took place in the wake of the rediscovery of Egypt after the invasion of the country by Napoleon in 1798. This was a period when academic journals began to appear. Schliemann made his discoveries of Troy and Mycenae, his putative discoveries, in 1873. And universities in this country began to fund archaeological expeditions. So Berkeley, the University of Chicago, and then Harvard, who worked in conjunction with the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. They funded an exhibition at the pyramids at Giza. Morgan had an advisor in fellow trustee William Laffin, and he had visited Boston's excavations in Egypt. And he said, we have to do this for the Metropolitan Museum. We need to fund our own expeditions, and found a Department of Egyptian Art. So in around 1906, the museum hired, away from Boston, the chief field officer in Egypt, a man named Albert Lithgow. And Mr. Lithgow's his favorite pupil at Harvard, Herbert Eustace Wenlock. And the Metropolitan also hired Edward Robinson, who became the director of the Metropolitan Museum. He was hired away from Boston. And together, Morgan, with the curators, plotted to make the collection at Boston they wanted to make their colleagues in Boston look like relics of bygone ages. So this is This led Mr. Morgan to fund and give carte blanche to the curators, the archaeological expeditions in Egypt, and the curators were able to make huge numbers of purchases in a very short period of time. In a period of 5 years, between 1906 and 1911, they formed a collection of Coptic art because of Mr. Morgan's desire to find Jesus. They wanted to acquire the material that was becoming available at the time that had come out of the sites that the Met was active in at Karga Oasis, starting in 1908, and other areas in Egypt that were being excavated by the French and Germans and British. And Morgan decided, after funding these expeditions, that he would commission his own boat, a dahabeah, so that he could return to Egypt. He would have an outpost on the Nile, and he would come and visit the curators and the archaeologists, and they would take him around Egypt. They were not always happy about this task because he could be ornery, but on the other hand, they were very happy to have such a munificent donor. And so there's one other factor that led to the formation of the Coptic collection, and I will move to these architectural fragments from Bawit and make my concluding statement there. So if we'd like to move, then I can show you. So these last three objects that I will discuss, they were excavated in Bawit in Egypt. This was a dig that was initiated by the French in 1900, discovered and initiated by the French. And these are architectural fragments that come from the churches. And the catalyst for the acquisition of these objects, a very important fact in the history of the museum, is the creation of the Rogers Fund in 1901. Mr. Jacob S. Rogers was a manufacturer of steam locomotives from Paterson, New Jersey, and he left most of his fortune to the Metropolitan Museum. Little was known about him, but this enabled the museum to set up a fund so that they could make purchases. And most of the purchases were made possible by this. Most of the purchases in the area of Coptic art were made possible thanks to this fund. And, but the catalyst behind all of this fury of activity that was taking place in the first 2 decades of the 20th century was Pierpont Morgan. As president, he played an active role in the development of the museum's collections, the creation and staffing of departments, the plans for the expansion of its buildings, and the inauguration and funding of the museum's own archaeological expeditions in Egypt. So I will hand over the microphone to if anyone has any questions, but I thank you for your attention.
What we hope that y'all are hearing is the interest the museum had in the very beginning in looking at this material at a level of non-pharaonic art, when much of the world really was throwing away the Islamic levels, the Christian Byzantine levels to get to the pharaohs. And it was in large part, I think Lyle has discovered in the past, that Morgan's interest in seeing this material, you had a quote from one of the Egyptian curators in a earlier presentation about their dislike of having to record the Christian level.
That their dislike of having to
record the Christian level as they went to the good stuff.
Yes, well, it was incidental. I mean, it was available at the time, and Morgan wanted them to acquire it. And so they felt that they could build a collection cheaply. And so they were really working at the encouragement of Pierpont Morgan.
And we sent the architects that were on our digs to record the floor plans of all the monasteries in Egypt. So it was not just the objects, but the whole context. Yes?
In your research, did you discover that Morgan, despite having all these advisors, had a really great eye himself and played a big part in the selection? Did you find that?
Yes, I think he did have a very good eye. He was also somewhat blindly acquisitive. I mean, he could, sometimes there would be boxes that hadn't even been opened in his house because when he saw something that he wanted, he bought it. And he did not want to bargain. And this was an area of contention between him and the curators because he would go to Egypt with them on these tours between 1911 and 1913, and he would go to the antiquity shops. They would take him around to visit the dealers. And the dealer would ask some outrageous price for model funerary boats, and he wanted to pay for it, and they said, no, you'll be inflating the market, you can't do this. And he wrote, I know that Wenlock thinks I'm a fool, but I want the boats, and I don't want the 1,000 pounds. So he went back the next year, and he bought these boats. But that was they fought over this area of his purchasing and his desire to acquire at any expense. Yes? Thelma, did you have a question?
Well, actually, it was interesting to hear that the mosaic was on display for about 10 years. How about the large collection of materials, the Coptic and other Christian materials that J.Pierpont Morgan?
Yes, so they were installed at the time when the digs were taking place in Egypt. Wenlock was in Egypt and Lithgow was here in New York. And Lithgow was arranging the installation of the Coptic material, and they created new galleries that were 4 or 5 new galleries, and they were very excited about the Coptic installation. And these objects were on display from 1911, I believe, until 1939, and that's when they were transferred to the Department of Near Eastern Art, and then they were taken off display and placed in storage in the bowels of the museum. And so when I was able to work with Helen on the reinstallation, we went into the basement and found all these objects, including these fragments that had mounts on them. And so because of the change in curatorial organization in the museum, and also the change in American taste, many of the objects went down into storage. There was a small installation that was mounted by the Department of Egyptian Art, which still had jurisdiction over the Coptic collection, some of the objects, that was mounted in the 60s or 70s, but it was very small. And so they were, in 1999, reinstalled in the Mary and Michael Jaharis galleries, and the Coptic collection some of it is now on display in the crypt-like gallery under the grand staircase.
And in the Islamic galleries.
And in the Islamic galleries, there's a display as well.
I'm just wondering what evidence we have about how important were religious interests or consideration on the part of Morgan in comparison to other interests. I mean, you mentioned that, he was motivated by religion, but what evidence do we have of that? How strong was that?
Well, I think when he recorded that he fell to his knees at the tomb of Christ, and he spoke animatedly about seeing the place where David fought Goliath. I think it was genuine, and I do think it motivated his collecting. I mean, he was Episcopalian, and I haven't studied his faith extensively, but I do know that he made these statements that suggested that he had this intense fascination with sacred places.
He was very active in the Episcopal Church, and as based on Corby Finney's work, as a general, overly simplified theme, Protestants were looking for the historical Christ and the proof that biblical texts were accurate. Darwin had arrived, and it was creating vast changes in the way we looked at everything, and it was a particularly Protestant obsession to prove the Bible real, which is why the two sisters go to Sinai to look for a text, and Morgan seems to have been involved in that approach to a great extent. We're so on time. I'm shocked at ourselves. This is one of the two galleries in the exhibition that look at the peoples of the southern provinces, and the only way we could look at them was really through their expressions of their religions. Otherwise, nothing that one finds is actually very easily attributable to any one community. And in the gallery you're in, you're looking at the National Church of Egypt, the Coptic Church, and behind you is the Orthodox Church of Constantinople as it reaches into the provinces as the official church of the empire. And in the next gallery, where we're going to have the last of our presentations, we have numerous works that go with pilgrimage sites, which would have brought people from all over the world, and then the other religious community that we could show well that was so important in the region, which is the Jewish community. And our works that we borrowed for the show go from Tunisia through Jerusalem to Syria, but we're particularly interested in this context in the works that come from a synagogue in Tunisia. And if you move in and right around the corner, then I'll introduce Ed Bleiberg to speak on that.